Welcome to this deep dive. We'll be taking a look at Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond.
Oh, excellent choice.
It is, isn't it? It's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah?
Desmond digs deep into how our society kind of perpetuates poverty, and I think the thing that surprised me the most going into it was the role that the more affluent of us actually play in that.
Yeah.
So before we get into that, though, I think it would be useful to maybe frame our deep dive today
Okay, yeah.
with this kind of one big question.
Mm.
And I think this is just a really surprising fact from the book. You ready for this?
Hit me.
Okay. The US government gives more aid to those who need it least. How's that even possible?
Well, I think that's what we're going to be unpacking today, right?
Yeah.
Desmond's argument at its core is that poverty in America isn't about a lack of resources. It's about systems that benefit the well-off, the affluent, at the expense of those struggling. And I think that's really reflected in the way we allocate resources.
So give me the juicy details here. What did Desmond actually uncover? What are some of the facts and figures?
He starts off with a very shocking statistic. In 2020, the federal government spent $193 billion aiding homeowners. Now, homeowners, they're mostly affluent. But when it came to direct housing assistance for families, low-income families, we only got $53 billion.
Okay, so wait a minute. Are you saying that almost 4 times the amount is going to people who probably already have a decent house to live in?
That's exactly what he's saying, and that's really disturbing.
Yeah, that's messed up.
And it gets worse.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so Desmond also uncovers these instances where funds that were meant for poverty, to alleviate poverty, were totally misused.
Oh, wow.
Like in Mississippi, for example, there was a 2020 audit
Okay.
that revealed that money for the poorest families was actually used to hire an evangelical singer
What?
for rallies.
Okay, so instead of using the money to help people with basic needs like housing, like food, they're having rallies with singers.
Precisely.
That's so wrong.
I know.
It makes you think, is this just a one-off? Or is this happening in other places?
And Desmond argues, actually, that it's not just a one-off. It's a systemic issue.
Okay.
And he uncovers stories from Hawaii
Okay.
and Tennessee,
Uh-huh.
where states are literally hoarding these federal funds that are meant for temporary assistance for needy families.
Really? Wow. It really makes you question, how are these decisions being made and who is it that benefits from these messed up priorities?
It's a great question, and I think it really leads us to this whole idea of the deserving poor, right? We have this stereotype of poor people as being lazy, right? But Desmond's findings really flip that narrative on its head.
Yeah, absolutely. He totally dismantles this lazy stereotype by highlighting how the government actually favors the affluent in a lot of ways.
Yes, absolutely. For example, let's talk about mortgage interest deductions. So, this policy lets homeowners deduct the interest that they pay on their mortgages from their taxable income. Now, on the surface, this seems pretty fair, right? I mean, it encourages homeownership.
I mean, yeah, I guess so.
It makes sense, but because of our progressive tax system, where higher earners pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes, this deduction ends up benefiting wealthy homeowners far more.
Ah, okay. I'm starting to see where you're going with this. So someone who has a bigger mortgage, higher tax bracket, they get a way bigger break than someone who's got a tiny mortgage.
Exactly.
Lower income. Okay.
So it's not as neutral as it seems. It actually exacerbates the gap between the rich and the poor.
And meanwhile, we're seeing all this money being diverted away from resources for those who are really struggling.
Absolutely.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah. What's even more, striking is that the very people who benefit from these policies are often the loudest voices that are opposing public aid programs.
It's like a double whammy. They take advantage of the systems that benefit them, and then they turn around and deny help to those who actually need it.
Exactly. And I think Desmond really wants us to consider this inherent bias in the system and how policies, even with good intentions, can actually perpetuate this cycle of poverty. Have you ever thought about that? Like how policies you might support could actually be contributing to the problem?
Honestly, that's a really good question. I don't think I have. It's not something that I've really stopped to think about.
Yeah.
So it's like we're all kind of sleepwalking through this.
It is, and I think it's very uncomfortable, but I think it's necessary to confront
Yeah.
because it leads us to another unsettling aspect, the exploitation of the poor.
Okay, now we're getting into some dark stuff.
Yeah.
Exploitation, what do you mean by that?
Well, Desmond talks about how several actors actually profit from poverty.
Really?
Yeah. You have your big banks.
Okay.
They rake in billions from these
Yeah.
overdraft fees,
Yeah.
which disproportionately hit low-income folks.
Oh, yeah.
Account holders.
I've been there. Yeah. It's so easy to overdraft when you're living paycheck to paycheck.
And you know how much it costs low-income families?
How much?
$250 a year.
Wow.
The average.
So basically, it's like being penalized for being poor.
Essentially, yes.
Oh, man.
And then you have, predatory lenders
Right.
trapping people in these debt cycles with these crazy high interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have landlords, in poor neighborhoods charging inflated rents.
So it's like everywhere they turn, there's someone trying to take advantage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where Desmond kind of implicates all of us.
Wait, us? What do you mean?
He argues that we, the middle and upper classes, were complicit, often unknowingly, but we're complicit in this.
I don't get it. How are we involved? I'm not the one charging those fees or those rents.
It's more subtle than that. We consume the products and services, right,
Right.
that are made possible by these exploitative practices.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So think about the companies you support.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if they're engaging in, ethical labor practices? Are they paying a living wage?
To be honest, I don't always pay that much attention to it, I
Yeah.
look at the price.
And that's precisely what he's talking about.
Right.
Our choices. They have consequences.
Yeah.
And by supporting businesses that exploit their workers, we're essentially fueling the problem.
Okay, wow. This is all starting to feel really heavy. It's like, what's even the point of all these government programs if they're not addressing the root causes? Like, are food stamps actually helping? Is housing assistance actually working?
Yeah, and that's where things get even more complicated.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about how poverty in America is less about individual failings
Right.
and more about these systems that are sort of designed to keep people trapped.
It is really disheartening when you think about it like that.
It is, but the question that we ended on was about these government programs. The food stamps, the housing assistance, are those actually making a difference?
Yeah. Are they actually effective?
And this is where Desmond sort of gets into this tricky territory, right? He acknowledges that these programs, they're important,
Mm-hmm.
like, things like food stamps, the earned income tax credit, temporary assistance for needy families. These are lifelines
Right.
for millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is, he argues, they often don't actually address those root causes.
So it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. You're stopping the bleeding, but you're not dealing with the actual damage.
Exactly.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, let's take housing vouchers, for example. They have families afford rent, which is great. But the problem is they don't prevent landlords from raising rents
Right.
when the tenant's income increases. So you might get a raise, and suddenly you can't afford your apartment anymore, even with the voucher.
So they're just constantly stuck in this cycle of playing catch up.
Exactly. And a similar issue arises with things like tax credits, those that are supposed to help low-income workers. They can actually help, but they can also let companies keep wages low, basically relying on the government to subsidize their workforce.
Wow. So it's like we're trying to fix a broken system with more broken system parts.
In a way, yeah. And Desmond really argues that these programs, while well-intentioned, they're often treating the symptoms, not the actual disease.
So what's the cure then?
He advocates for policies that actually empower people, in the workplace, in the housing market, give them real agency so they can actually escape.
So what would that look like?
Well, I think one thing that he points to is these grassroots movements
Okay.
that are fighting for things like unions and tenants' rights.
Mm-hmm.
They're pushing for fair wages, better working conditions,
Right.
affordable housing, tackling those root causes.
So regular people like coming together saying enough's enough, we need change.
Exactly.
I love that. But it also kind of feels like, David and Goliath. It's like, how can they possibly win against these massive systems?
And it can definitely feel that way. But throughout history, social movements have really been the catalyst for change.
That's true.
Think about, the civil rights movement, workers' rights, economic justice.
It's inspiring to think that even when things seem impossible, collective action can actually make a difference.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that really speaks to what Desmond envisions as, this poverty abolition.
Poverty abolition, it's not just about reducing poverty, it's about getting rid of it altogether.
Right. It's a big idea, and it requires a real shift in our thinking.
So how do we get there?
Well, I think it starts with understanding just how deep this problem goes.
Okay.
How deeply entrenched it is in our history and in our systems.
So what does history tell us about poverty in America?
Desmond argues that our current system has a long, long legacy
Okay.
of exploitation and systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
He traces it back to slavery and the way Black Americans were systematically disenfranchised.
After the Civil War.
Yes,
It's a dark past for sure.
it is. And these historical injustices really laid the foundation
Mm-hmm.
for the economic inequality
Mm-hmm.
that we see today.
It's like this wound that never quite healed. You can still see the scars.
I love that analogy.
So it's not just about individual choices or bad luck. It's about recognizing that the system itself was built on inequality.
And Desmond also emphasizes that, even policies that appear to be, race neutral
Mm-hmm.
can actually have a totally disparate impact
Because of that history.
because of that history. Exactly. So, for example, let's look at housing policy again.
Right. Housing seems to keep coming up.
And it is really central.
It's this whole conversation.
Absolutely. So Desmond points to practices like redlining, right?
Yeah.
Where banks wouldn't give mortgages to people
Right.
living in certain neighborhoods,
Right.
mostly Black and minority communities.
So they were intentionally keeping people out of certain areas, not based on their finances, but on their race.
Precisely. And that created this segregation. These communities that had different levels of opportunity, different levels of investment,
Right. Different schools, every
infrastructure, healthcare, all of that.
And that continues today.
So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Poverty leads to more poverty, and it's almost impossible to break out of that cycle.
And so Desmond argues to truly abolish poverty, we need a fundamental shift
Okay.
in how we understand justice and equality.
Okay, so what did that look like?
It's not enough to just acknowledge the past.
Right.
We need to repair the harm.
Right. So it's not just about equal opportunity now. It's about addressing the disadvantages that were built into the system from the very beginning.
Exactly. And I think this really brings us back to Desmond's emphasis on housing
Yeah.
as a key driver of poverty. It's not just about having a roof over your head. It really determines your opportunities.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about housing vouchers.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about predatory landlords.
Mm-hmm.
What are some other aspects of housing that Desmond, dives into? Well, one thing is, federal policy really favors homeowners
Okay.
over renters.
Yeah.
Remember that statistic we talked about, right? Like $193 billion for homeowners,
Yeah.
$53 billion for low-income families.
It's a huge disparity. It's almost as if this system is designed to keep certain people as renters and help other people become homeowners.
You're picking up on a really key point there. And it's not just about the money either. Desmond talks about zoning laws.
Zoning laws?
Yeah.
What do those have to do with anything?
Well, zoning laws determine what type of housing can be built
Okay.
and where.
Okay.
And a lot of affluent communities, they actually use these laws to block the development of affordable housing.
Oh, wow. So they're intentionally trying to keep poor people out of their neighborhoods.
They want to keep their neighborhoods exclusive. It drives up property values. And Desmond calls this exclusionary zoning.
So we have these invisible walls
Yeah.
that are keeping affordable housing out of certain areas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it creates this cycle where wealth basically creates more wealth,
Yeah.
and poverty just gets concentrated.
In these certain areas.
It makes it very difficult to get out.
So on the one hand, you have this American dream of homeownership, but then on the other hand, you have a system that is preventing people from achieving that dream.
And Desmond actually challenges that whole notion of the American dream
Really?
of homeownership. He argues that for a lot of people, it can be a trap.
Wait,
Hmm.
how can homeownership be a trap?
Well, especially if you're financially vulnerable. It comes with a lot of risk.
Okay.
If you lose your job, you get sick,
Right.
something unexpected happens.
You could lose your house.
You could lose your house.
You could lose all of your equity.
You could fall deeper into debt.
So it's like, for some people, it's a pathway to building wealth, and for other people, it's a path to financial ruin.
And that's especially true in communities of color
Mm-hmm.
that have been targeted
Mm-hmm.
by predatory lending practices. Think about those subprime mortgages. Those loans with the higher interest rates for people with lower credit scores.
Mm-hmm.
Those were really aggressively marketed to Black and Latino families.
So they were pushing these risky loans on people who were already at a disadvantage.
Absolutely.
And then when the housing market crashed, those communities were hit the hardest.
Of course, lost their homes, lost their savings.
Yeah, it's like the system was set up for them to fail.
And that gets to the heart of what Desmond is arguing, that poverty in America isn't about individual circumstances.
Right.
It's about a system designed to create and maintain inequality.
So if it's that ingrained, that baked into the system,
Yeah.
is there even any hope?
And that's the question, right, that kind of haunts this entire discussion.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're up against like this massive, insurmountable problem.
Right. We've been talking about these systems that seem designed to keep people trapped in poverty. We've looked at the history, the policies, the exploitation. It's all very bleak, to be
Yeah,
honest.
it is. And it's understandable to feel that way.
But I think Desmond, despite all of that, actually offers us a message of hope.
He does. Okay, so what's the solution then? Is it about personal responsibility? Or is it about, like, dismantling the whole system?
Well, I think for Desmond, it's not an either situation.
Okay.
He really believes that change is possible.
Okay.
But it starts with changing the way we think.
Okay, so that individualistic narrative, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps thing.
Right. We have to reject that.
Okay.
Poverty is not just a personal failing. It's about systems that are creating and perpetuating inequality.
So it's not about telling people to work harder. It's about recognizing that the rules of the game are unfair.
Exactly. We're all connected, right? Our choices, our actions, our policies, they all have consequences.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to create a society where everyone has a fair shot.
And speaking of responsibility, Desmond uses this really interesting term. He calls for us to become poverty abolitionists. I love that. But what does that actually mean? Like, in real life, what does that look like?
I think for Desmond, it's about imagining a world where poverty doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about working towards that.
Mm.
And he really emphasizes these grassroots movements, the power of people coming together to demand change. You know, throughout history, we've seen these movements, the civil rights movement, the labor movement.
Right, the fight for economic justice.
And they've shown us that collective action can disrupt the status quo.
So people uniting, saying we deserved better.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And there are movements today that are doing amazing work, fighting for things like a living wage, affordable housing, racial equity.
I love it. So how can we support those movements? How can we be part of that change?
There are many ways. You can volunteer your time.
Mm-hmm.
You can donate to organizations working on these issues.
Okay.
You can educate yourself
Mm-hmm.
and talk to others about it.
Yeah, spread the word.
Exactly. Even small actions can make a difference.
It all adds up.
It does.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the statistics, the policy debates, but we can't forget that poverty is ultimately about human suffering. It's about real people, real families, struggling to survive, denied opportunities, feeling trapped.
Absolutely. Desmond's book really is a call to see the human faces behind the numbers.
Yeah. And, you know, reading his book, I actually felt a sense of guilt. Like, I benefit from this system, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed and helpless. Like, what can I possibly do to change this?
And I think that feeling is natural.
Yeah.
It's natural to feel guilty when you confront these truths.
Right.
But I don't think Desmond wants us to stay there in that guilt.
Okay.
I think his message is ultimately one of empowerment. Once we understand the problem, we can choose to act differently. We can choose to be part of the solution.
So what does that look like? How do we go from feeling guilty to actually making a difference?
I think it starts with looking inward,
Okay.
examining our own lives, our choices, and how we might be contributing to this problem, even unintentionally.
It's like looking in the mirror and being honest with ourselves.
Exactly.
Right.
And the answers are going to be different for everyone, right? Some people might decide to volunteer their time, others might support organizations financially, or advocate for policy change.
So find your own way to contribute.
Find your own way, yes.
Okay.
And know that even small acts, when multiplied, can create a real movement for change.
One of the biggest takeaways from Desmond's book is that poverty in America is not inevitable. It's a choice. We, as a society, have made choices through our systems and our actions that have led to this.
And we have the power to make different choices,
Yeah.
to choose a path where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
I love that.
Desmond's book is a challenge to confront uncomfortable truths and then commit ourselves to creating a different world.
So to wrap up, Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America is a powerful call to action. It urges us to look beyond the individual, understand the systems at play, and recognize our own role in perpetuating or dismantling those systems.
And it reminds us that a world without poverty isn't just a dream, it's a possibility.
It's a possibility if we're willing to fight for it. So that's it for this deep dive. I hope you learned something new today, and I hope it sparked a fire in you to make a difference. Until next time, keep questioning, keep challenging the status quo, and keep believing in a better future.